My name is James Twain. At a little past 2 a.m. on the night of January 3rd, 2007, I was awakened by a knock at the front door of my recently purchased house in Littlejohn, Illinois. When the knocking didn't stop, I got up, went down the stairs, and opened the door. A man was standing outside in the cold, a man of about 45, somewhat short, bald, wearing a white t-shirt and sweatpants. He said he had flipped his car at the end of the road and wanted to know if he could use my phone. He didn't seem injured at all, and he confirmed this to me. He'd swerved to avoid a man on a bicycle coming around the corner and hit a freak bump and overcompensated by jerking the wheel to avoid a stump. And the next thing he knew, the entire car was upside down. No one had been hurt. The man didn't seem too terribly disturbed by this, just inconvenienced. I let him come in and pointed him to the phone in the kitchen, and when he went that way, I stepped out onto the front stoop. Green Temple Road was a very long one, so I couldn't see to the end of it. No other cars went by on the road. It was bitterly cold, so I went back inside pretty quickly. The man was already coming back out of the kitchen. His call had been very quick. I asked him if he wanted some water or something, but he politely declined. I had to ask him the question of why he had walked all the way to my house instead of something closer. And he shook his head and looked away, saying that he felt like he might be in shock. And he looked up and down himself to make sure he was absolutely not injured. He didn't remember hitting his head, but he couldn't be totally sure. I told him to sit down, that we really should call for an ambulance, but he positively didn't want that. He apologized for troubling me and headed out the door without another word. I wondered who exactly he had called when he was in the kitchen. I watched him head to the west, walking more or less normally, until he disappeared into the dark beyond a streetlight. Then I closed the door and went back up to bed. Sleep was a long time in coming, as I imagined the stark terror my visitor must have felt when his car began to tumble. I wondered if I should have trusted him that the man on the bicycle wasn't hurt. But by the time I would have gotten to the end of the road, surely the police would be there. So, selfishly, I let it go. I checked the local newspaper the next day for any mention of a single car crash near me, but I struck out. That afternoon, when I was walking my dog, I went a little out of my way to roughly the spot where I figured the accident had occurred. From the way the man had described it, I figured I isolated the spot pretty well, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Out of nagging curiosity, I knocked on the door of the house across the street. A woman answered, herding two young children away from the door. I said hello and asked her if she had been awakened by an accident the night before. She said no. And coincidentally, she had been awake right around 2 a.m. She'd been watching a movie on TV, but hadn't heard a thing. I decided to let the mystery lie there. It was almost 3 weeks later that I came awake in the middle of the night again. It was 2:57 to be exact. I wasn't sure why I'd awoken. There hadn't been any sound to make it happen. My dog, Lexa, was sleeping in a cushioned chair in the corner of the darkened bedroom, but when I came awake, she immediately did too. Right away she began to whimper and whine, which was unusual. She got up and came to me, doing more of the same. I thought I'd use the bathroom and then go down to the kitchen to get her dog treat. I started down the stairs to the bottom floor when I got a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked into the darkness of the living room, and I saw a shape, someone sitting on my sofa. Quickly I reached behind me to turn on the light in the staircase. It cast enough light that I could see that my visitor from the other night was in my home, sitting on the sofa staring into space. He was dressed exactly the same as he had been the night of the accident. His stare was vacant and strange. It was a full 2 seconds after I turned on the light that he turned his face to me. I muttered a very nervous hello, making my disquiet very obvious, I hoped. The man looked up at me, and without changing his expression, he said hello in a friendly manner. I came to the bottom of the steps, but I moved no closer. I asked him if he needed help. He turned away from me, looking out the front window of the house again. He shook his head without a word. I asked him what he was doing here. I had to ask a second time because he didn't seem to hear me in whatever daze he was stuck in. The next time he spoke, his voice was somewhat softer. I had to lean forward to hear him. He said, "They were just dolls to me," or something like it. I couldn't be sure if that was exactly right. I took a couple of steps toward him, but I stopped short of actually entering the living room. I told him he had to go, but he only kept staring through the window. Without hesitating, I walked quickly into the kitchen, letting him out of my sight, and I took my cell phone out of its charger, and I dialed the police. I didn't want the man arrested, just taken to wherever he needed to go. Something was very wrong with him. As I dialed, I walked back into the living room to tell the man that I was calling someone to take him out of there unless he wanted to leave himself. But he was gone. The space on the sofa where he'd been was empty. I turned to the front door, but it obviously hadn't been opened. There hadn't even been time, and I would have heard it. I looked up the staircase. Lexa was there, whimpering. I would have heard creaking footsteps on the bare wood if he'd gone up there, but again, it had been maybe 10 seconds from the time I'd left him to the time I'd returned. He couldn't even be gone. It didn't make sense. I stood in the living room for several minutes after that, looking out the window at the road outside. Lexa never left me. I went to the front door and I opened it. I decided for my peace of mind that I wanted to make absolutely certain the man wasn't around anymore, so I went to the edge of my driveway and looked in both directions. The street was empty, of course, or so I thought at first. But then I did see something. All the way down Green Temple Road, just before the point where it curved out of sight, there was a streetlight, and sitting beneath that streetlight, with his back against the pole, was a man. He was so far away that at first I couldn't even be sure it was my visitor. But then that faraway stranger raised a hand and gently waved at me. I did not wave back. I could see no details of his face, but it was obvious that he was wearing a white shirt, just sitting there in the cold beneath the streetlight. I turned and went back into the house. I went up the stairs, Lexa following me, and I went into my bedroom, crossing it to the window which looked out on the spot where I'd just seen the man. There were trees blocking the view, and even though the branches were leafless, I couldn't see. At some point I felt comfortable enough that I could lie down and close my eyes. But sleep wouldn't come, and didn't come for the rest of the night. I just couldn't be sure he wasn't coming back. The next day I was tutoring players at the golf club I manage, when I got a call from my ex-wife about the house we'd sold a year before. It reminded me to check something on my cell phone. I looked at all my outgoing calls for the past month. The information for each one was stored. Looking at the night of the stranger's accident, I didn't see any outgoing call at all. He'd gone into the kitchen to use my phone, but no call had been placed. That night back at home, Lexa's whimpering actually woke me up. It was only a little past midnight and I'd been asleep for maybe an hour. She stood at the side of my bed. There was nothing really urgent about her sounds. She just seemed unhappy about something. I got up and felt immediately afraid. I stood in one spot, shushing the dog so I could hear anything that might be going on in the house. But there was nothing, no sound. Before I went downstairs, I looked around for some sort of thing I could hold, something heavy, just to make myself feel more secure in case the stranger had gotten inside my house again and become more unpredictable. It was going to have to be a golf club. I picked it up and took my cell phone with me as I went to the staircase. I turned the light on before I headed down and again waited for any sound, any sign that someone might be down there. It was just impossible to tell. The living room, at least, was empty. From there, I went into the kitchen and went to the cupboard to get a glass. That was when I stepped on something in the dark. I looked down and saw 3 small objects on the kitchen floor spread out. They were dolls, children's dolls. The one I had stepped on was a standard Barbie type of doll, and the others were similar but made to be children. The adult doll was beside the counter where the sink was, and the other 2 were a few feet away at the base of the refrigerator. They were all face down. I didn't get too close to look at them at first. I left them where they were and continued through the house, turning on all the lights and checking all the doors. Before I opened the basement door, I replaced the golf club I was holding with a baseball bat from my tote bag. I hadn't changed the light bulb in the basement since it had blown out a week before. I was too distracted to pick one up at the grocery store. I rarely went down there. I took the flashlight from one of the kitchen drawers, and I opened the door, shining it down the stairs. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response. I descended the first 3 steps, their loud creaking making me wince inwardly. I didn't want to make any sound. I moved the beam of the flashlight across the basement, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The only place left to check was back upstairs. I went from room to room, ready to swing the bat, but I was alone. When that was all done, I came back down and I picked up those dolls, setting them on the counter. There was nothing unusual about them except for their presence inside my house. I'd eaten dinner in the kitchen and then more or less gone right to bed. Sometime in the past 2 hours, they'd appeared. All the doors in the house were locked. I put on some clothes and I took Lexa and I left. I didn't want to be in the house at all. I wouldn't be able to sleep there, not tonight and not for a while. There was a dumpy motel about 5 miles away on I-30, and I checked in there. I didn't know what else to do. When morning came, I went back to the house and found that nothing else had occurred. Before night came again, though, I went back to the motel, and I checked right back in. Over a solitary dinner in some chain restaurant, I sat and I thought about what came next. I am a pragmatic and rational man. But I did have an experience as a teenager that changed my beliefs in a powerful way. I was 13 years old at the time and miserable because of my mother's remarriage to a man I hated, the perfect example of the bad stepfather, a tough disciplinarian who I feared. One night I was in bed alone in my room very late at night when I felt a light brushing on my ankle. I kicked what I thought was a bug or something away from me, but it returned a minute later. It felt like a finger trying to trace something on my ankle. Again and again I shifted, and at one point I got out of bed and stood up. But when I returned to a prone position, it came back. There in the dark, I began to get very spooked. I didn't want to turn the lights on, though, for fear my stepfather would see them and become angry that I was awake. So I lay there in my bed, shutting my eyes tight. This time, I let the finger trace a broken path on my ankle until it stopped 30 seconds later. It didn't return that night, on which I stayed awake till dawn, but it did a week later. The sensation could only be described as a light finger writing on my ankle, making me come awake from a deep sleep. Utterly terrified, I nevertheless suffered in silence. I couldn't cry out. My stepfather would come running, and he would be furious. The finger repeated its motions 3 times before I wrenched my ankle away, stuffing my blanket in my mouth. When it returned once more, about 3 weeks later, I tried to sense what it was that it was writing on my ankle. It was a single word, and that word, I deduced, was toys. I wasn't mistaken. I knew this is what it was. 3 times, and then it stopped. I didn't have to jerk my leg away. It happened once more at the end of the month, a day after my birthday. I never told anyone. I was so intimidated by my own weakness that I thought something was wrong with me. Such were the thoughts of a very confused 13-year-old boy. Then one night, several weeks later, I came awake in the dark, and I began to feel a little sick to my stomach. I remember I was lying on my side facing the wall. My clock radio said 3:10. I'd left the local rock station on very, very low when I fell asleep, but now it was silent, off the air. There was the tiny sound of low static in its place. It was at that exact moment that all at once, out of nowhere, I felt a cold human hand seize my right ankle, gripping it violently. My will broke at once, and I screamed and I thrashed in terror. The invisible hand let go. My mother and my stepfather came into my room as I cried, and I simply broke down before them, all the terror I had somehow bottled up coming out in tears and whimpers. I was practically doubled up with the force of it all. It frightened my parents to the point where they obviously didn't believe me when I told them that I kept having terrible dreams of dying. But they didn't push the issue. After that, I never was awakened again in the middle of the night by the feeling of something touching me. But I knew my occasional awakenings at 3 or 4 in the morning as a college student, and then as an adult, were a remnant of the fear of feeling that hand return. Because of this episode, I was almost ready to believe that the man who had entered my home after his accident was not truly alive. There were a couple of things I needed from the house, so I did swing back over there at about 8:30 on the night after I'd left upon finding those dolls. As I pulled up, my headlights picked out a man standing on my doorstep. He looked like he was affixing something to my door. I didn't recognize him when he turned around. I got out of my car very cautiously as he approached, but his demeanor set me at ease. He introduced himself as John, and he said he used to own my house before I did. We'd never met. I'd never had any dealings with anyone besides the realtor since the house had been vacant for a year and a half before it was sold. I shook his hand and he was apologetic. He said he'd explained things in the letter he was about to leave for me, and it was awkward to be here now, having to explain in person. He asked if we could talk inside for a bit. I said okay. I turned on all the lights inside. John and I sat in the living room, he sitting in the exact spot where the stranger had. John explained that he lived in the house with his wife for only 6 weeks before moving out. The realtor had told me it was because of a sudden military deployment, but John said this wasn't true. He wanted to know if I'd encountered anything unusual since moving in. I found myself telling him almost the whole story of the night visitor, and he seemed to understand perfectly. The same man had come in the night to him as well. There had been 3 such visits, he told me. His story and mine were almost identical. At first I couldn't believe it, but I made sure to parcel out my information carefully so he couldn't simply follow my tale. He mentioned the dolls in the kitchen before I even could. We rose, and he pointed out the spots on the floor where he had seen them, and the experience mirrored mine precisely. The events were repeating themselves. When I asked him what the 3rd visit from the stranger was like, he fell quiet for a moment, disturbed by the memory. He'd awoken one night to see a shape at the foot of his bed. It was the stranger. John's wife had screamed and screamed beside him as the stranger merely turned away with perfect calm and walked out slowly through the bedroom door. John, who had begun already to believe that they were dealing with a ghost, had calmed her and held her down instead of attacking the stranger. And then, 2 nights later, the cycle had begun again, with the stranger knocking at the door and asking if he could come in to use the phone after a car accident. His manner, his speech, his movements had been identical to the first encounter. John had slammed the door on him, and he and his wife had left the house that very night, never to return. The stranger's name, John told me, was Mason Berkman. He was a postal carrier who had lived in this house from 1992 to 1997, when he'd killed his wife and 2 daughters with a hatchet one night. He tricked them into going into the basement, then waited for them in the kitchen to return, attacking them right there. He'd done this for no other reason, it was believed, than that he was having an affair with a woman across town and he was afraid of being discovered. After the killings, he'd gotten in his car and driven at great speed toward the end of Green Temple Road, losing control and flipping when he had ironically swerved to avoid a complete stranger, while his family, his children, lay butchered behind him. It must have been an instinctual reaction. He wasn't killed immediately. Berkman had climbed out of his car and, bleeding internally, most likely in deep shock, had stumbled down the road. He made it all the way back to his own home, collapsing in the foyer, dead just around the corner from the kitchen. This had been in all the newspapers at the time. I'd never known about it, coming here from out of state. John had returned to the house when he'd heard from the realtor that I'd been here for a month. He had to know if the haunting was still going on. He apologized for what I'd endured and offered to buy the house back from me. I asked him what he thought would happen if I stayed. He wasn't sure. Maybe there would never be any real danger. Or maybe Mason Berkman's appearances would metamorphose into something else. John then suggested something a little strange, which was that he wait up in the house for Berkman to return. Like me, he was both horrified by the goings-on, yet also compelled to find out more. But I thought it best that neither one of us ever come back here. We left the house after shaking hands. He drove his way back to a different county, and I drove to my shoddy motel. I was unwilling to sell the house to anyone else, but financially unable to keep it. By the end of April, I was in desperate straits. It was then that I began to research and write to organizations that might be interested in the house as a site of paranormal investigation. Reputable organizations were extremely difficult to find. I did receive a call back from one in particular, the Fernmoor Fund for Psychical Research. The woman on the phone asked me to write my story down in as much detail as I possibly could, starting before the visit from Mason Berkman and ending not with his second appearance and the discovery of the dolls, but everything that came afterward. Everything. This, she stressed especially. So I did so, and I sent her a 20-page letter this time instead of 2. A week after that, she came to see me personally. We met in an Irish pub on the side of Route 22. I end this story by saying that a family of 6 lives in my house now. They're in no danger of any supernatural visitation. The woman from the Fernmoor Fund explained it all to me. It's actually been 4 years since I met Mason Berkman. A few days before movers would come to remove all my things from the house permanently, I returned one more time. I went at night. I almost never made it out of the car, I was shaking so badly. I spent some minutes calming myself, disappointed that if I was able to remain silent for so long with a ghost touching me at age 13, I couldn't bring myself to confront one more. Eventually I was able to stand on my front step, put the key in the lock, and push open the door. Even before I went inside, I could sense a presence in there. He would be in the living room, of course, waiting there every night. I moved forward, and I looked to my left, into the living room. John, the man who had pretended to be a concerned homeowner from up north and my ally, sat on my sofa in a pool of moonlight. On his lap he held a shotgun. John Horace, brother of Livy Berkman and uncle to Beverly and Samantha Berkman, stared into space, waiting for the cruel monster who had slaughtered his loved ones to return so he could exact revenge. His ghost had tricked me into allowing him into my home, and now that he was here, he would never truly leave. There may even come a night, the psychic researcher had told me, when the two would meet, and there would be great violence. Or perhaps I would witness John Horace's suicide by hanging, which had occurred a year after his sister's burial. There in my home, John Horace slowly turned his head to look at me. He asked me if I'd seen a man outside drive off in a Ford Escort. I said no. He asked me if I'd heard a crash. I said no. He then told me I shouldn't go into the kitchen. I left him then and exited the house. To this day, I think, but am not certain, that I saw rope burns on the man's neck. No one but me would ever be able to see either John Horace or Mason Berkman or the dolls on the kitchen floor. It was my innate nature that allowed me or forced me to see them and become part of their demented drama, and to feel that icy hand on my ankle 3 decades ago. What it also means, I've been told, is that I may not be done with encountering the supernatural world. Another ghost could appear to me at any time. In fact, if I were to return to my childhood home even now, and go to sleep in the room I grew up in, I might feel that mysterious hand again, writing the word toys on my ankle. It's just who I am. I'm a 1 in a million shot. The only real escape for someone like me is to keep moving and keep forgetting what I've seen and felt. Just last Friday night, I was at a party for a technology executive at a very nice house in the country. There were at least 100 people there, and I was having a good time meeting everyone when I noticed someone who didn't seem to be moving in a chair in the corner. Looking more closely, I saw it was a young woman sitting straight upright, whose flesh had gone an ashen gray all over her face, drawn and blank. Both her eyes were utterly bloodshot to the point where they were almost black. She was motionless, dead for a long time. People moved all around her, mingling, not seeing her. I walked closer and took in every detail, standing there with a scotch in my hand. She wore a necklace with a blue stone. Her ankles had been tied together with wire. Her feet were gone, severed. Blood was dripping on the floor. I left the party and I drove home to the dark countryside, and instead of wondering who I had seen and why it was there that I had seen her, I simply began to hope that my life would not be such a long one, that my affliction would end before it drove me mad.